it's people with a passion, and that passion is image making, and that passion is a genre of art practice. That passion is the infinite possibilities that emerge from joining up letters in the alphabet. It's endless, and it's something you do together, and it's about being together. And for me, more than just about illegality, I think it's often illegal because that's kind of how it has to be to happen, rather than being illegal for the sake of it. So I think it's more, I think graffiti is more for something than against something. It's more like done because of rather than against, even though, of course, that does, form part of it.
Hello, welcome back to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're taking a fresh look at an old form of expression, graffiti. The topic is controversial and often evokes a mixed barrage of responses, as witnessed by today's audience comments. But since graffiti has been around for a very long time and is not going away, perhaps it's time we made our peace with it, or at least try to understand it a bit better. Well, what is graffiti? Is it art? Is it ornament, or just vandalism? Originally thought to have come from the Italian archaeological term graffito, meaning a deliberate mark made by scratching or engraving on a large surface, such as a wall, nobody really knows. While the ancient Greeks and Egyptians may have first coined the term, the definition and origins of modern-day graffiti continue to be debated. We're going to continue the discussion here and now, assisted by two knowledgeable guests. One, a philosopher, and the other, an artist, indoor and outdoors, historian and curator. Rafael Schacter is an anthropologist at University College London and head of the Material, Visual and Digital Culture Department. In his latest tome, Monumental Graffiti, he proposes that we think of graffiti as a monument and says it demands our urgent attention as a form of expression that challenges power structures by questioning whose voices are included in or excluded from the public space. Schacter has curated exhibitions at London's Tate Modern and other galleries, and in addition to studying graffiti for the past 20 years, he somehow found the time to produce this big. Okay, Schacter is joined by Cambridge artist Caleb Nealon. He's co-author of The History of American Graffiti. Way back in February 1990, Nealon was a 13-year-old kid on a family trip to Germany when he came upon the newly opened Berlin Wall covered in graffiti and murals. It was a revelatory moment for the teenager who soon became immersed in the global graffiti scene, both as an artist and as a commentator on the movement. Over the past 3 decades, Nealon has done murals and art projects in museums, hospitals and schools in over 20 countries, as well as still painting for fun on the street, he says. He's written more than a dozen books and curated numerous exhibitions and mural projects. So welcome to you both, gentlemen.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thanks,
Well,
Mary.
I guess we should start with the definition of graffiti. Growing up in London, I used to like graffiti and saw it as a kind of form of an anarchistic expression, really, political, usually witty, and definitely anti-establishment. But now I think I've got that all wrong. Perhaps you guys are going to give us new definitions of graffiti. So let's start with you, Raphael.
Thanks, Mary. It's great to be here. Great to be here with Caleb as well. So, of course, there's so many different definitions of what graffiti could be. You have political graffiti, which is maybe what you were talking about. There is gang graffiti as well, gang writing. What I'm talking about in the book, and I think what a lot of people are talking about within when we're thinking about the relationship between graffiti and art, is a very particular genre of art, a particular genre of name writing, emerging out of the east coast of the US in the late 1960s, broadly associated with the cultural world of hip hop, but really having a whole kind of different variety of influences and actually emerging first way before kind of hip hop actually started. A really kind of cross kind of disciplinary form of practice in which it's very much about the writing and the propagation of the name. Something which also developed and was kind of canonized in a series of kind of important books and films and magazines that emerged from kind of the 80s onwards. So now very much kind of a global practice of what you could call like capital G graffiti, which is for me separate from things like latrinalia, like toilet graffiti writing, or separate from overtly political graffiti, but can still have as much kind of political power, if not more than maybe overt political writing through the practice and kind of the kind of image itself.
Wow, sounds extremely complex.
Yeah, I mean, it's, this is something with, now like a 50-year history with a folk history, something that kind of Caleb has written about at length, something with a canon behind it, something that is totally outside of the kind of institutional art world, something that has had obviously constant kind of relationships with and battles to the art world, but something as I'm sure we'll talk about today, in which kind of the essence of the art or the essence of the practice juxtaposes and kind of rubs up against the way we understand capital A art, institutional art, the art controlled by places like the Tate and the collections and the canon that they create.
Okay, Caleb, so tell us about your introduction to graffiti first, and then how you got so excited and involved in it.
Sure. Well, I had the little story that I like to tell is the romantic side, which was being in a 13-year-old in Berlin and running around with with this newly opened Berlin Wall, and how there was art all over the wall, but it was like, okay, I was old enough at the time to understand this was kind of like the backyard fence of the neighbor that we were sort of raised to distrust, dislike, whatever it was, tail end of Cold War kind of setting. And there was all this crazy art and writing all over the wall, but it was the side of freedom that had this stuff on it. There was none of this stuff going on the inside, well, I guess it was the inside, since it ringed the free part. um but it was something that was kind of sending a little bit of a message of like, oh, the art kind of won. It kind of went through. That's my really, really elevated romantic version of what a 13-year-old was thinking. I also was a, antisocial bored teenager who liked being creative and bad at the same time. And boy, was this a nice mix.
So then, had you already been a person that enjoyed drawing at 13? I mean, was it something you
Sure.
already...
Yeah. I mean, I was encouraged to be creative. I had parents that totally supported that. So, um, but I came home, and because I was a good kid at the time, we went to a nice Quaker school where, you went, if you did bring something home for somebody, as like a little souvenir to show, you tried to bring it home for everybody. So I brought little pieces of Berlin Wall home for everybody in the class, and it was all, I had to, the stuff that had graffiti on it was, higher value, so I made sure everybody got a little piece with the...
Wow, that's a collector's item now, I imagine.
It's one of these little things that, I mean, I'm sure you can go online and buy them off eBay, but they're it's something that it's kind of like a little personal story treasure for me.
Yeah. Yeah. So, the 60s, you can both talk to this if you wish. So you say it basically started in the US in the 60s, this graffiti movement originally.
You
Caleb, I'll
can
leave
say that. It's I think what why was it that you had graffiti of local toughs writing their names in neighborhoods, really goes a long way back. I mean, that's sort of a thing that local toughs do. But what happened in the late 60s was, I tend to look at it as it's technological. And the
Mm.
technologies were spray paint and magic markers. And they're so lo-fi now in our thinking that we don't really think that, like, oh, there was a time when such things didn't exist. But it was, as soon as those things became cheap enough for anybody to purchase, or better yet, steal, they were being used to write on the walls. And so you can see that in photos all over. If you go look at archival photos of basically any city through the 60s upheaval of the United States, you'll see writing on the wall being done in spray paint, some in magic marker, but spray paint was really good for this. And then what happened in both New York and Philadelphia in the late 60s was something clicked that it became, I'm just going to make this about getting my name around. I'm going to have my name, and it's not going to be, it may be my real name, it may be a nickname, it may be some other kind of name, and it's going to be something about me. And the whole point of this is I'm going to write this all over the city, and people are going to see me all over the city, and it's going to give me some kind of notoriety. And you got to think like a teenager here, because this is who was doing it. Um, and it might help me win the notice of that girl too. Would be a big thing. Although there were a lot of girls doing this too, but it was also, like I say, you have to think like a teenager. And then once that became a game, humans love games. You're going to try and do it a little better than the next guy. You're going to try and do it more than the next guy. You're going to do it in crazier places. And then really New York was where this magical period between like 1971 and 1974, teenagers were off to the races. They moved onto the subway system, and they said, okay, you're going to do it with just your name. I'm going to do my name with a star. And the other guy says, I'm going to do my name with a star and a heart and an underline. The other guy says, I'm going to use two colors. The other guy says, I'm going to do it in big bubble letters and fill them in. The other guy says, I'm going to do that and then add a 3D. And the other guy says, I'm going to do that and add a background. And then pretty soon you had multicolored full subway cars. And this was all by teenagers. This was all completely illegal. Nobody was supporting this. This was a game. It was a city game. And it became this incredible art. And by 74, certainly, there were definitely things that you'd be really hard pressed to say, this isn't creative. Whatever you thought of where they put it, people were definitely doing things that looked a lot like art. You may have really wished that it had been somewhere else. By 72, 73, 74, this was all happening.
I think that just to add to that, I think the developments like that happened in that era, the speed of the developments, like thinking about it like stylistically, thinking about it aesthetically, thinking about it like as an image, but also as a practice, the developments that happened in that short period of time, I genuinely think still aren't the how creatively incredible it was, how like dramatic the images that emerged in that era were, even though subway art is probably the most seen, if not the most bought art book of the 20th century. I still don't think people have really understood the incredible moment that was in New York in terms of just the pure creative energy that was being produced in the city. I don't really think there's been anything like it.
So actually, we're going to pull up an image now. This is a typical example of graffiti that we'd see on the subway. This happens to be the wall of the London Underground at Holborn Station. So Raphael, could you talk us through what we're seeing here for the uninitiated?
Of course, yeah. So I think what's interesting is that everything that Caleb was just talking about in terms of like, I'm going to use two colors, I'm going to add stars, I'm going to add outlines, I'm going to add 3D. This work definitely plays within that canon of graffiti that was formed during that early era in New York. And there is a canon, right? A canon which kind of emerged due to kind of these like very influential books that kind of were propagated all around the world. But that this is an image which works within that canon. The second thing I'll say is this is not a common thing you would see in London, because most of the graffiti in London is quick and fast and hard and dirty, because London has probably it's thought to have the most surveillance in any other city in the world. And the graffiti that is produced in the city is produced in symbiosis with the city. And so, you could say that a city gets the graffiti it deserves, and London gets very ugly graffiti, which is prized due to that ugliness, because it's about its efficacy. It's about getting things up as hard and as fast as you can to evade the surveillance of the city. This is not like that. This is a piece, it's actually a memorial piece. It says Robbo. This wasn't produced by Robbo. Robbo died about 10 years ago, maybe 5 years after this piece was actually produced. So this is a memorial piece. It's also a piece that I believe was produced on Christmas Day, which is a very kind of famous day for graffiti writers. It's the one day the London Underground doesn't work, doesn't isn't in,
Right.
and so it's a
Excellent.
day which is very common that there is graffiti produced on the London Underground. It says figgy pudding in the bottom right, which is a traditional
Christmas. Right.
Christmas dessert, and there's also kind of the white snow kind of dots around the edges of the piece. But this is a memorial piece, right? So this is not produced by but for Robbo, right? This is a piece which would not last long. It would have been removed probably the next day. But this is a form of memorial graffiti in which memory is like preserved through the act. It's through the doing of that mural, that memorial piece, that graffiti piece, that Robbo's memory is continued on, and you'll still see his name painted all over London. So this is quite a particular piece in terms of like where it is, when it was produced, but equally it is a piece which does work within that kind of wider canon of like classic graffiti writing, in which there'll be a character or here the O has been turned into kind of a CND sign. There'll be the name, and there'll be a particular kind of genre and style which it will emerge through.
So if you're looking at that, could you estimate how many people have put their mark on that? Just guessing. Is it two? Is it?
Yeah, I think probably. I mean, there would have been the whole kind of track would have been done during that day, probably by a group of maybe 4 people who would have done kind of a whole range of pieces in the station.
Right. Right. Caleb, have you got anything to add to it, Caleb?
Not really.
Okay. All right. So if you had to say what the purpose of this is, if there is such a thing as explaining it, one person had written in the audience comments earlier, this is just vandalism, an invasion of public space which belongs to everyone, and then we have to pay to clean it up. What do you say to that kind of criticism?
I love that kind of criticism because it opens up such a can of worms that then won't go back into the can. So vandalism first. Vandalism is a great term, right? Vandalism is a subjective term. It's like barbarian, which is often interchangeable with. It's a very prejudicial term, right? It's not talking about the quality of the work. It's just saying something is bad and pollutive. And obviously, pollution is really a matter of like where it's placed, and it's a matter of subjectivity. Vandalism is also like if you say, okay, well, it is vandalism. Vandalism is also part of the history of art, right? It has a central place in the art of the 20th century. Gustav Metzger had auto-destructive art, which was all about destroying the art he made. Ai Weiwei's dropped hand dynasty vase is probably his masterpiece work and is the destruction of a piece of Chinese national heritage. So vandalism is both a subjective term, but is also a term which then opens up lots of ideas which are present within the contemporary art world. Invasion of public space. I mean, has anyone like mentioned advertising? Like our public spaces are totally polluted, vandalized by private advertising. Advertising are private companies who are selling private objects in public space, right? That for me is a much more vandalistic invasion of public space. I think to even compare the invasion of public space by graffiti writers and huge advertising corporations is to me like just a bizarre kind of non-equivalence there. And also public space, right? This idea that, public space belongs to everyone. No, it doesn't. Public space belongs to those who have the power and the finance to control that space. Public spaces go back to kind of the very birth of the public space in Athens in the Agora. Who was allowed in public space? Well, propertied men. So like 1% of the population, if that. Public space is not for everyone. It is a privilege to be able to be in public space. So, for me, just there are so many ideas there that kind of start, once you start peeling them back, really all become like problematic. For me, this is about an engagement with space. It might not be something you like, and that's fine because public space is a space of difference where there will be things you don't like. If you like everything in the public space you're in a public space's echo chamber, which is not a space for everyone.
Caleb, do you want to answer that? To that comment about vandalism?
I mean, it was all sure. I agree with all that, but I think the person who, the people who do that know all that and they do it anyway. Um, it doesn't you liking it or you approving of it doesn't have anything to do with their, with them doing it. They're doing it because they want to, and does that make it okay? I mean, well, that's the judgment of society there. Um, but they know very well that they're breaking the law when they're doing it. That's
Mhm.
very foremost in their minds. You can be sure of that.
So I guess another question would be, is there a message here in what they've just expressed? Or is it just proof in some way that a certain person made that mark on that wall? Um, it, is that important? Is that part of what's important about it?
I think keeping that name, Robbo is a very particularly important name in the history of London graffiti. And writers who pass away early are often memorialized by their peers for oftentimes decades afterwards.
Mm. Mm.
And it sort of speaks to the continuity of the movement as a whole. When the people who are respected and who pass away, their memories are kept alive by
Mm.
their peers within it.
Mm. And that's
So
actually
you're,
beautiful.
you're
Sorry.
resonating with some people in the audience here, this about what you said about public space. This is a nice comment. I love Raphael's and Khalib's answer to the vandalism question. I'll continue to think about these things. Okay. Then there's another question here about the Berlin Wall. I'll get my thing onto work. I love the reference to the Berlin Wall, which made me think of the scene from the film Wings of Desire, when the angel turned man, Bruno, question mark, sees art in color for the first time, a la Dorothy in Oz. And it is in the form of the art graffiti and it is in the form of the graffiti on the Berlin Wall. Are the guests familiar with the scene? Do they feel much as I do about it? A profound statement by Jarmusch about where he stands on the subject.
It's not Jean Rouge, is it? It's not Jean Rouge. I can't remember who it is, but it's not Jean Rouge. I watched it recently. It's a beautiful film and a beautiful moment in the film. And I think
Isn't it Wim Wenders? Wings
it's
of
Wim
Desire?
Wenders. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
Wim Wenders. Yeah, thank you. Um, I mean, the Berlin Wall is, probably the most famous wall of the 20th century, right? And the graffiti on it would still exist in the kind of the East Side Gallery, which is heritageized, which kind of opens up lots of kind of interesting kind of problematics in itself. But the Berlin Wall really is like the kind of the Wall of the 20th century. It's the most classic wall, and the presence of graffiti on it was all part of that. So what then becomes difficult when it's like, oh, that's not vandalism or pollution, but this is, and then there's this kind of choice made of deciding, oh, well, this is bad and this is good, which when you start to like unpack it doesn't really have a clarity to it. And I think that's one of the key issues is thinking, okay, well, what is it and who is it that defines where something is acceptable and where it isn't?
It's interesting because some of the stuff is very aesthetically appealing. And just like you said, public signage and big ads are often very ugly. And we don't really have much to say about those things all really. So if you were trying to define this, I know it's difficult to put things in boxes, but what do you think differentiates graffiti from street art or murals, or is there no difference?
I can do this one. I mean, for people who come up in the name-based graffiti kind of who come up in those in that within that framework, graffiti means writing a name and that it's name-based and it's letter-based. Graffiti writers are really, really, really into letters. That's the big thing. And that it really, really will count for a lot more if it's illegal, for one, or if it can still be graffiti but done legally, hopefully by someone who's done a lot of illegal stuff. Street art is kind of things that are done maybe without sanction, but are done kind of like where graffiti, something you can't call graffiti because it doesn't fit into those strictures of the letters. Um, and then murals is sort of a little bit of a different Venn diagram. Something can be a mural is just it's on a wall. It's a wall painting. That's a pretty strict
It's a
art
big,
word. So it's a big
wow.
wall painting. So
Mm.
that's really where that goes. So can it be graffiti in a mural? Yes. Can it be street art in a mural? Yes. Can it be a mural in neither? Yes. So,
I
Gosh.
think what's also happened is there's been like a constriction of what is understood by street art.
mhm,
Um, I think in particular since the 2008 street art exhibition at Tate Modern, in which they had these like amongst other kind of works in the exhibition, they had these six giant murals on the front of the building. I'm actually extremely critical of that project as a whole. However, following that moment, street art became huge, colorful murals and really also became part of this wider project of kind of creative city transformation and actually eventually very much part of a gentrification project. So street art, what I call street art with a capital S and capital A, like street art as like institutional genre, became something which was really kind of a purely, almost purely muralism. Whereas beforehand, street art had been like quite a kind of diverse practice of like public installation, working through images over text, over letters, but often coming from at the start artists who had come through graffiti. So at that kind of early stage of street art, there was still like a kind of an ethic, kind of a wider practice that had that kind of lineage of graffiti, even though it was moving into a more publicly legible form of image making because it was images, not text.
mhm.
So, Caleb, you now receive some very respectable sponsorship from big organizations all over the world. You've done your murals. So, is there a difference for you when you're doing a project like that as to when you're doing your own street art, as you call it?
Sure. It
Or are you
takes,
being paid?
well, no, I mean, the paid part doesn't necessarily have anything to do with anything. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just a nice to have whenever it happens. But it's just the organization time, you know. There's a lot more emails and prep involved in sanctioned, organized stuff. It's a project. The thing that I love and I've fallen off on because just because of life things I haven't done as much of, but I still love it, is just going out with friends and painting something. And it's just really like it's at that point, it's like golf with a photo. You're going out there with the guys and you're not talking about your family, you're not talking about work. You're just enjoying the day and you know what you're doing and you're painting something, you take a picture and you're good, and it doesn't need to be anything more than that. It's just, and there's nobody's paying for it. You're doing this because you do it. And, it's just a creative way to spend an afternoon with the guys. So
I
that,
think so.
yeah,
To continue that, I think it's such an important point that Caleb makes because there is this understanding of graffiti, of the graffiti writer as this like masked, hooded, like antisocial lone with a baseball bat going out there at night and like on their own, like a kind of Cape Crusader. It's like that kind of depiction of kind of the single graffiti writer. A graffiti writer is almost always in a kind of collective. They're almost always it with other people. It's a very, very social practice. It's a community of practice. It's actually a very geeky practice oftentimes. I
yeah,
mean, yes, right, you know, there are there is like the tough guys, there is the egos, there is toxic masculinity as there in within any subculture. But from having done, lots of ethnographic work, spent a lot of time with graffiti writers, it's people with a passion, and that passion is image making, and that passion is a genre of art practice. That passion is the infinite possibilities that emerge from joining up letters in the alphabet. It's endless, and it's something you do together, and it's about being together. And for me, more than just about illegality, I think it's often illegal because that's kind of how it has to be to happen rather than being illegal for the sake of it. So I think graffiti is more for something than against something. It's more like done because of rather than against, even though, of course, that does, form part of it. But it's about commitment. It's about committing together. It's about being together and working together and having those kind of shared goals. And for me, that part of it is really, really beautiful. Like that part of the practice is it's just really, really kind of, yeah, what's the best word for it? It's very sweet. It's very like, it's about that kind of creative essence that is a beautiful thing.
When you get together with a bunch of artists, and it's a very fun thing to do because you've got this, and it doesn't come across in any other art in the same way, because you can get together with, you get 10 writers on a wall, you can do a 250-foot wall in a day, and you start out by rolling it out with a roller and everything like that, and you kind of mark out everybody gets a certain amount of space, 15, 20 feet or something like that, and you've got your paint, and you kind of chit chat, and you kind of talk to the people next to you about how you want to address the spaces between yours, and and you talk about the intricacies of what you're doing. You talk about your outline color and your fill color and your this and your that, and you nerd out, and you sound like a bunch of, interior decorators when you're talking about all the different color names on the paints, because we don't mix our paints, we buy them all, so you have to know the name, which, so you have 350 different silly color names in your head, and you got a bunch of people from, and then at the end of the day, you there's a 250-foot mural, and there
Mm.
wasn't there before. And that very like basic art impulse to just make something that wasn't there before, like when you multiply it out, that's really fun. It's really satisfying.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a
The other
difficult
thing
question.
too is that it's done. Like it's there and other people are seeing it. There's
Right,
no other steps you need to take. It is
right.
complete. It is activated. The museum is open.
Mm.
So you said to me earlier that you enjoy doing a lot of things with your daughter. You go out in the woods and you like to enjoy nature. So is this something that you could see yourself doing in a few years, that you and your daughter go out on this expedition to do graffiti together, or was that
I've
not?
taken her to paint. She's painted before. I mean, we've painted since she was little. I mean, you grow up with an artist dad, you're gonna paint. So she's painted before. But I
No, I
follow.
didn't mean paint. I mean paint on something that's you're not allowed to paint on.
Yeah, I mean, she's gone and we've done pieces together.
Mm. I think this actually just kind of refers to the question that's in the chat that someone said actually there is someone paying for it, the owner of the building or surface you painted on who has to pay to remove it. And most oftentimes these graffitis occurring on like grey spaces. It's occurring on spaces in between public and private that aren't really kind of owned, that are in kind of, you know, brownfield sites or that are on the edge of train tracks. Like who really owns these are non-places. Like graffiti, there are rules to graffiti. Like they are often tacit, but they are very clear. Like, you don't paint on people's private homes, right? You don't paint on people's private cars. You'll see any white van in London or in New York, any commercial vehicle will be covered in graffiti, but not people's cars. So there is a clear understanding of what is public and private. It's very, very, very rare that you'll get graffiti on someone's private home. So when you think about who pays for it, and this is this question of cost, and like graffiti, when it's criminalized and when graffiti writers are sent to prison for graffiti, it is through a financial cost of the crime. But what's also interesting is the cost of the cleaning of graffiti has gone up maybe 50, even 100-fold since the private in the UK, since the privatization of the train rolling stock. So the cost of removing graffiti is so hugely inflated. I mean, it's quite inconceivable how much it costs to remove graffiti. So when we're thinking of, and often the graffiti that is removed, people may not even want to be removed. One of the boroughs in London, Camden Council, you can have graffiti on your own property, and the council can come and remove it and then charge you for removing it, even if you don't want it to be removed. So this whole kind of issue of cost, the graffiti removal industry, which is $1 billion industry, does not want graffiti to disappear. The war on graffiti, like the war on drugs, like benefits people. So I think this whole issue of like cost, I think is really a red herring.
Hmm.
I've just come back from Athens, just very quickly. Just come back from Athens. Line one in Athens is covered in graffiti. It's one of the few train lines left that are covered in graffiti. The state aren't removing it, but they're paying €1.5 million a year to have four drones, 24-hour, flying above the train yards to prevent any more graffiti coming on. Right? It's this kind of, it's much of this and much of the cost about it is to say, oh yeah, we're doing something about it. It's this kind of almost like a macho response to the existence of graffiti. I think if you asked most people in Athens, would they want €1.5 million spent on, social housing or whatever it is, some sort of program for kids? or they want it to have four drones flying above line one and on the train tracks, I think we all know what they'd say.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions coming in. I've still got quite a lot of questions on here for you. So, Raphael, in your book, you talk about the old established understanding of the word monument, which really is a kind of durable, spectacular structure, top-down statement of power, omnipotent reminder of public authority and the status quo. That pretty much is the broad blanket for monuments. There are also some more contemporary contradictions, I think, to that. There's the Vietnam memorial, the September the 11th memorial, and then Martin Luther King here in Boston has this amazing sculpture, The Embrace, which is just beautiful, which is probably an alternative challenge to the original white power structure. So you go to the etymologic foundation of the word monument, which you say goes back to the Latin, which is monument as reminder, advice, and warning. So if it's not too difficult, can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So for me, when I talk about the monument as something which is this kind of institutional top-down structure, which is about kind of permanence, power, which is large, often very phallic, often made of expensive materials, that is why I actually call the institutional monument, like a very particular kind of genre of monumentality, a kind of neoclassical form almost always, and something which emerged out of the birth of the nation state, in which these actually very precarious, fragile nations needed these physical, large, permanent structures to remind people that they were actually beyond time rather than very fragile. But actually, a monument, as you just said, is just a reminder, an advice, or a warning. And the physical form that it comes in many different places can be wildly different. So, as you mentioned, I'm an anthropologist, and there are many monuments within different cultures in which the monument is impermanent. So, as with kind of the counter monumental culture, which emerged especially after kind of the Holocaust, the Shoah, in which artists and architects kind of refused to reproduce the type of monuments that really were integrally fascist in their character, and so had monuments that would disappear, for example. There was a very different conception of what a monument could be. It's something I talk about at length in the book. So a monument could disappear. A monument could be marginal or minor. It could be peripheral. It didn't have to take on this large scale permanency that we're so used to. So in the book, kind of as a thought experiment, but as in a kind of very literal way, I say, well, what happens if we say graffiti is a monument? What does that do to our understanding of graffiti? What likewise does that do to our understanding of monuments? If we say graffiti is a reminder, an advice, and a warning about the kind of the changing nature of the city, an advice about our engagement in the city, a reminder of people, of bodies, of commitment, I think it enables a very different way of thinking about what graffiti and what monuments are or could be. I mean, and look, in particular, like in the US, right? The issue with Confederacy monuments. Here, the history with these kind of colonial monuments to empire. There is a question to be had here, right? The state is protecting, for the most part, against the iconoclasm of these kind of often what could be called slurring monuments, these kind of very violent monuments to segregation. And on the other hand, there's an iconoclasm on graffiti in which all sign of it must be erased. So, from my anthropological perspective, it's just a question, right? What do we do? How do we think about what these monuments or these images or these objects, these artifacts are doing? How can we unpack that? And how by seeing them as a monument in a literal way, can we say, well, how is it acting? What is it reminding? What is it advising? What is it warning?
Wow, interesting. Especially since there's a sort of ephemeral aspect to graffiti, right? Its impermanence is part of it.
But that impermanence is something which has a much more permanent effect. So, for example, we are surrounded by men on horseback. Do they mean or remind us of anything? No, their very permanence leads to their forgetting, right? We place all the memories into them so we can forget them. Whereas I've been given directions by a graffiti writer who told me to turn left at like, it was the like turn left at the Sonic piece And that Sonic piece had disappeared 3 years before, but it was still the place where it was,
Marker, yeah.
right? So, what shines bright and disappears can leave a much more lasting effect in the memory than something which remains permanent. So the ephemerality of artifacts, of images, can often give rise to a much more powerful memorial effect than something which lasts forever. And also, nothing lasts forever. So there is also this like obsession, with our public monuments, we are constantly conserving, cleaning, spraying the kind of the dirt and the pigeon shit off them to give them this kind of veneer of permanence, which they certainly do not have.
So somebody's written in here, can graffiti involve political slogans?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Hence the one that you did with the writer with the pen, which we're going to see in a minute, right?
That wasn't a political slogan, but sure.
I think
Uh,
there's, graffiti writers have politics. Like, I think, I would argue that graffiti I mean, I think all art is political. But I think graffiti, by its essence of appearing in public space when it's not supposed to, has some like innate politics in terms of thinking about like the rights to the city, the rights to appear on communication networks, the right to visibility, and alongside that, often does and can contain like more overt messages. But I think that it's by its very kind of nature, it is political, even if that's implicit, not explicit.
okay, I'm going to bring up a topic now. Caleb's going to cover his ears because he didn't want to hear, I know, but we're going to bring up Banksy because, most Americans are quite familiar with the work of this British artist who I think we've got some of his work we can be looking at while we're talking, who stealthily and anonymously creates art on public buildings for free, often with a political subtext like this one, which is Show Me the Money, Monet, play on words. Often with political subtext, which includes laughing at the actual art establishment. So we could see a couple more, I think, of those. That's the most famous, probably the girl with the balloon. And this is a nice man throwing a bouquet of flowers, but it looks like he's throwing a weapon, which is very clever. So, Raphael, you wrote a great piece for The Guardian in October in which you talked about the theft of Banksy's works from public space, and then they're actually sold off at auction sometimes. But you also say graffiti is meant to decay and die naturally. So destruction is an accepted and expected part of the game. So can you explain this and why it's very different from how we preserve art?
Mm. So I think, Banksy works, and Banksy, he's probably the most famous artist in the world today. Like his success is really quite unparalleled. Um, and a lot of his work around the art establishment is very punny, even if some of his other work is kind of on the edge of kitsch. But his popular success does mean that his works become conserved, right? They become part of like a heritage regime in which they will be kind of covered with perspex, or they will be like physically removed from their site, the whole wall kind of taken off and placed in a gallery setting. I remember walking past Saatchi and Saatchi a few years ago, and inside their kind of foyer was like a wall with a Banksy on, kind of ridiculous scaffolding, kind of holding it up. So I think what's happening with a lot of this kind of heritagization of his work, and then kind of an equally heritagization and conservation of a lot of kind of other street art works, whether that's the work of Keith Haring or others, is you get this kind of tension about kind of concepts of preservation. Graffiti writers know their works are not going to last. There will be kind of a varying kind of temporality to it. Memorial works will last longer than other works, because both other graffiti writers won't go on top of it. And often local kind of graffiti removal teams will kind of understand they are memorials. So there will be kind of maybe an increased temporality to them. But there is an always expected understanding that graffiti will not last forever. Like it's paint. Paint is like, you can scratch it off, it weathers. The pollution will kind of disintegrate it. So paint is very, very thin. It's millimeter thin. It will eventually disappear. But writers understand that. And I think there is a conception within this, which is a much more um, kind of human kind of conception of our material world than the one that kind of our museum world and kind of our art world tries to affect, which is a freeze framing of everything that comes into its path. So this idea of like the museum as a mausoleum, like the museum is a place where objects go to die,
Hmm.
right? That they are frozen out of time. So they're not part of like the living world. So I think graffiti, it lives and it dies. And also that process of decay is itself often very beautiful, right? An image can look more in place, can look more satisfying when it doesn't look brand new, when it doesn't look totally fresh. And so that kind of expectation of it having like a kind of a life world, having this kind of arc of life, rather than trying to kind of have this false attempt to preserve it, does really create this tension with the whole kind of dynamic of the art world and the museum world and this idea of like heritage and conservation.
Okay, I'm looking at a question that came in relation to what you just said. Um, if traditional monuments are funded, planned, and granted through permissions, then can graffiti adopt the same definition of monument without having the same original intentions? Wow, that's a tricky one.
I think if institutional monuments are funded, planned, and granted through permission, I don't necessarily think traditional monuments. I like, I think we have memorials and monuments in our own home to like, and to our own ancestors, to our own kin. I think there are a whole, like a multitude of different ways that we can remember people. So, on the one hand, I think, I don't think monuments are about being funded, planned, and granted through permissions. I think that's just kind of institutional monuments, which are very much about power, authority, kind of hegemony. Can graffiti adopt the same definition of monument without having the same original intentions? I don't think that the very kind of concept of an institutional top-down form defines monument. I think we can have monuments that are small scale. We can have monuments that are intimate. I don't think it has to be this kind of big top-down state authority that creates them for something to be a monument. And a monument is a reminder, an advice, or a warning.
Interesting. So, Caleb, I think we're going to look at some of your work now, because we've talked about a lot of ideas and concepts, and I think maybe you can explain some of this. So, these are all going to be different uh, depictions of what you've done in various parts of the world. So maybe you could start with that
Sure,
particular.
I'll rifle through these. Now this was one that I did in Berlin in 2010, and going to Berlin is always special for me because of that origin story. So this one is very different from what I usually do, but the organizers of this project, they asked if I could do something in grayscale, and I realized that what it was is they didn't want to buy all the paint for the if they had a little budget and if they could keep a little extra for themselves if they didn't buy so much color paint. But this was fun. I got to the American ambassador to Germany popped by with his people and stuff, so it was a nice experience. We can go to the next one. So this would be an example of street art per the definition we talked about. Now this is back in and around Boston, Cambridge area for years. I did these street signs that are installed there's the no parking signs have extra holes that go all the way down. I could just pop my own sign into them and I would just make kind of sometimes cute, sometimes funny, sometimes just whatever. I could just make signs and I would just make them on plywood. I made hundreds of these things and they're just, finger tightened bolts. Anybody really wanted to get it off could get it off. I'm not sure that they were illegal beyond like littering, and nobody ever minded. I never got any negative pushback, and I never hid myself on it, and I just did them. I did them all in the daytime and so forth, so no one cared.
So is that just a fun image? I mean, it doesn't have a
Yeah,
message.
no, that's just a fun image.
Okay.
There's a side of me that enjoys doing art for kids as well. And kids within us and all that. So it's a little something different for kids to notice when they're around, uh, or adults when they let the little kid in them notice things that are different and weird.
But I
So
think that's exactly it. I think it's that I love this image and I love this series of work that Caleb did because it's about the relationship to the signs that are above them, which are so formal, which are so clear, which there's nothing to be kind of miscommunicated. It's like parking by permit only. It's so intense. It's so bold. There's no conversation going on. You see this image that Caleb's produced, and you're like, well, what is this? What is it doing here? How does it relate? Why has someone put it there? What does it mean? It opens up so many questions because of that kind of ambiguity, but kind of knowability at the same time. So I think having things like this in public space is so important to have that. It's different, exactly as Caleb said. That bit of difference in the city for me is so vital when we are bombarded not only by advertising, but by this kind of uber direct, very kind of like harsh kind of information.
It's sort of frivolity. It's quite nice. It's a little.
And there's holes all the way down that are there on these signs. I had my own bolts. I had my own nuts. I had that was all like I wasn't taking anything off. I was just adding something. So, there was, I never, like I say, it was too, it was like so easy and likable that I kind of was like, all right, I'm done with this. I don't want to keep going with this. This is but you're welcome to do it. I don't. Again, I'm not really sure it's illegal. So this was a different situation. This is in Nepal. This was, and I say is, which is because this is a Methuselah. This is 21 years old. I did this in 2003. Um, 21 years old, and it's still running. This is at a park in Kathmandu in Nepal. Um, and this actually has sort of a traditional mural, allegorical, everything means something kind of setup in that you can go, I'll get into the weeds in Nepal on this, but if you Google the Nepal Palace Massacre, you can find this crazy story. Um, and that there was on the O in the Sonic up there, there's the king. He's a dinosaur because monarchies are an extinct thing. And then there are the Maoists who are the pigs. They're up there in league with the king, the hippos, the business interests coming up to sniff the king's butt. The tortoises and the elephants are the aid agencies, and they're kind of like moving really slow, but they're well intentioned. Oh no, the elephants were the male workers of the Nepal, and then there's ducks somewhere in there too. And then there's the giraffes. There's no giraffes in Nepal. They're the tourists. They're to take it all in. And I felt in that place that it was the situation that reminded me all too much of Animal Farm, and so I wrote across the top, all animals are created equal, but
That's amazing. That's a lot.
other. And so when I did this, there was actually a little like neighborhood group, but I didn't really explain it to them. I was just like, I want to paint elephants and turtles and all that stuff. So you can't tell a group everything, Go to this one is just a collaboration with my friend Katie Yamasaki, who is a marvelous artist. She does the figurative work, and when she does that, I just paint dots. Spray paint's the only paint that wants to be in a dot in a circle. It's the only kind of paint. It's the first thing you learn how to paint if you pick up a can of spray paint. It's wonderful to like engage passersby because they can help paint dots. I don't care whether you're like 2 or 3 years old or whether you're 70. You can paint dots with me. Um, and it's additive. I can just kind of make it all work. And painting with Katie, when you have this lovely lady painting this really recognizable face and figure, nobody notices me. So lots of fun. I just feel like I'm like playing the bass in the band. So that's in Queens. I don't know, a while ago. This is one of my favorite walls I ever did. This one is in Sao Paulo, Brazil in 1998. It's a collaboration. Mine is sort of on the colorful stuff at the lower left. It's a Sonic piece. Whole crazy, story with this as far as the lead up to it. Ended up running out of a building, getting hit with a lead pipe, and all this craziness. Big escape scene and everything like that. But then ending up painting this wall on a major thoroughfare where you got things just work differently there. The guy comes by and says, "Oh, you guys painting the wall?" And we're like, "Yeah, what's up?" And he said, "Oh, it's my wall." And we're like, "Oh, there's no problem, right?" And he's like, "No, no, no, go all the way. Just do a good job, man. Go up, get your ladders out and stuff, and go all the way up. Take your time." And the guys that I'm painting with, they're twin brothers. They're on the right-hand side, and they have they're bona fide rock stars in the art world now. They have a full mid-career survey at the Hirshhorn in DC right now. And they're, simply put, some of the most amazing artists of our generation,
Yeah.
along
So
with,
can I ask a quick question, Caleb?
yeah,
You back up just for one sec.
yeah.
Was that all done at different times? The bits you weren't all working on that at the same time, were you? All
No,
just
we were all doing it
you
together.
were. Okay.
Oh, it's all a big soup, you're all crawling all over each other and moving the
Right.
ladder in the middle of the other guy's stuff and climbing up on the bottom of the ladder to get a little higher spot while the guy's already up there and whatever. I mean, this is like I'm 22 in this, this is young. Um,
And Sonic, you should explain to people in the audience that Sonic was your sort of pen name, your moniker at that
yeah,
point.
that's the graffiti name because writing Caleb Nealon on the walls wasn't really
Right.
smart.
You said it a couple of times. I'm not sure people understood what that meant.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
That's just
Okay, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I think we have one more.
next one. The next one's really weird. It's in Shenzhen, China, in Dafen, which is if you've ever gone to a Walmart or something like that and seen oil paintings for 14.99 or 25.99 and wonder what the hell is a Walmart? Where does this come from? All these mass-produced oil paintings come from Dafen in China. They come in these massive workshops. It's where you can get your CEO portrait or your wedding portrait done. And so they put a museum in the middle of it to kind of make it an art neighborhood because it was what it was. And Shenzhen's a city of 20 something million people. And so I kind of replicated a previous piece of mine in there. And it was truly one of the weirdest art experiences I ever had. But again, this was, Chinese Communist Party government invite thing. And
Ah,
is that the last
so
one?
it was legal.
Oh yeah.
I was
No,
going to say, I wouldn't be inclined to paint a wall in China if I hadn't been given permission.
yeah, I don't know what it would be like.
Yeah, I don't know what the last thing you would do.
The whole like white thing would be different there. I mean, me being an American, I mean, I don't know what the whole deal
Mm,
would be there. I would be treated differently just because of who I am. Um, Being Chinese would be a different story. So,
mm.
but
All right, I've got a question to ask before we have to boogie. Um, so, Caleb, how would you feel now? You've got these beautiful pieces you've showed us there,
mhm.
particularly one with the little boy and all the color dots. If somebody came up and did a kind of a, I don't know, a defacement, for want of a better word, across it, how
Yeah.
would you feel?
Well, it's one of the things that like, I paint one of the great things about the dots is they're so easy to repair. I can just take a bag of cans and just kind of touch it up. In fact, I can send a buddy with a bag of cans. It doesn't have to be me.
Right, right. But you wouldn't leave the deface the what person added to it if it ruined the look of it, the aesthetic of the look.
I mean, sometimes these things are additive.
Yeah.
If it's a
But it's fun.
well-drawn dick, on the piece, like you haven't done anything until you have had people draw dicks on your art. Um, if it's well drawn and it is additive, sometimes you got to just let it be because I mean, remember this is it's a game. It's out there.
Let's
So
be clear. Duchamp Porter has done that as well. So yeah, we're in good company.
yeah.
Well, we have a couple of minutes left. Is there any final words? Oh, we do have a question here. What do the speakers think of Graffiti Alley in Central Square as a sanctioned space for graffiti, or is it an oxymoron and the nature of graffiti in such space becomes altered, colonized?
I think it's a nice thing to have. I mean, it was in my old neighborhood. I painted there a couple of times, because it wasn't ever my favorite place to paint because it was some place I was just walking by every day. But, as a as a high intensity graffiti legal space, I think there should kind of be one pretty much in every town. Just like I think there should be a skate park, just like I
Right.
think there should be, playgrounds for kids and a basketball court and all that other jazz. It's just like it's a recreation kind of thing, creative
Okay.
recreation.
Nice thought. What about you, Raphael?
Yeah, I think I don't know the exact space, but of course I know legal walls, and of course there are many different kinds of graffiti practices. There is a legal wall on a Sunday afternoon with some friends, and there is a nighttime mission on train tracks, in the middle of the morning, right? So I think there are very different kind of effects that happen within those. There's one which is more like a kind of Sunday painting vibe, and one which is a much more kind of high intensity adrenaline mission. And the kind of relations that are created through that are very different. But there's still forms of like relationality that are emerging. So, graffiti, I think we have to get beyond seeing it as this like pariah, as this like total evil. Like it's been around for longer than 50 years now. The war on graffiti has had such like a kind of devastating effect on the way it is understood, not let alone kind of the people who have been to prison, to category A prisons in the UK for putting, pigment on a surface, for a non-violent crime, let alone the way that the conception of graffiti is totally focused on like criminality and vandalism rather than as an art expression, right? It may be oftentimes illegal, but it's not always illegal. It may oftentimes, be, tough guys, but it's also just, regular people who want to be creative and want to engage with the city. So I think we really do need like a new conception of really of what graffiti is today.
Well, I think you've helped us understand a lot more about what it is. What about you, Caleb? Have you got anything to add as a final?
I don't know. I think it's always I hope that people can gain an understanding of graffiti. I think it's a good idea to gain an understanding of graffiti to get to a point of looking at something and saying, why do I like that or not like that? And maybe having a little more reasoning to it. And hating something for a reason is good. That's fine. No problems there. Graffiti writers never have a problem being hated. But and I think for a lot of cities around the world and places where graffiti kind of manifests, I think it's in and takes place and takes over. It's worth just asking, well, who cares?
Mm,
Like,
mm,
these are sort of the disused spaces. Like,
mm,
why is this a problem? Like,
mm.
I think sometimes it's like, oh, this is kind of where it goes. That's kind of cool. Like, it's got a space.
Agreed.
Okay, well, time is up, I'm afraid. That was a great hour. I really want to thank both my fabulous guests, Raphael, who stayed up late in London, and Caleb, who's a little bit down the road. But the knowledge and background and all that was great. Really enjoyable, really informative. I want to thank you all for joining us today, making the time, and happy graffitiing, if there's such a verb. See you on the 19th. Bye bye. Take care.